Hello everybody. Evan Abrams here with your video challenge in After Effects. It's going to be great. This is a pro tip for you. Me telling you some wonderful pro tips in After Effects. Today is going to be going by pretty quick. I got three things I want to show you, and they all are based off of Fractal Noise. So if you've used After Effects in the past, if you've made kind of complex things, then you probably already know that a lot of that starts with a base of fractal noise. You can think of this like a kind of mother sauce, I suppose, in cooking. This is a really essential ingredient, and getting to grips with understanding noise and how we can manipulate it is going to help you make all kinds of great stuff. One of the great things about noise in general is that you can loop it, which means since it's derived from math, you can just run the calculations all the way through in a loop, which will net you some wonderful, constantly moving, undulating, changing, but ultimately controlled types of things. What are we talking about? What are we going to be making? Well, we'll get into it in just a minute. I want to say hi to everybody in the chat. Hello, hello. Thanks everyone for being with us here today. It's going to be a fun time. Attica, Voodoo Val holding it down in the chat. Valder, what's going on? Umacorn, hello, hello. Penny Doodles, Robert Wegner, Venerberg. There we go. Now I'm getting it right. Hopefully I'm saying that. I never know if it's a W or a V, but let's get into it. This is going to be Fractal Noise 3 ways, and I hope you enjoy cooking along with me here. So, on the screen, I've got my picture down in a tiny little corner so you can see hopefully all of the stuff we want to manipulate. This is our first example, which is going to be creating undulating water in a pool using fractal noise. So if I just play this through, you can see we've got some caustic highlights going on up here. We've got the result of the shadow that would happen underneath. We've got a little bit of shadow in the pool already, but this is all fine. This is all going to loop. This is all based on a fractal noise at the very, very beginning, and everything feeds off of that. But then fractal noise can express itself in other ways. Here is some Aurora Borealis, if you would like to see some of that. Some undulating lights in the sky here crossing through. It's another wonderful use of fractal noise, right? Areas of brightness and darkness blended over top. We just skew it to get into this formation. So that's another use of fractal noise. And then way number 3, the third way we're going to look at is a much harsher one, what we tend to call anime speed lines, I suppose. A little something like this. So if you can imagine putting your Phoenix Wright character here pointing off screen perhaps, or layering multiple versions of this, we're going to look at controlling this, creating it, how we make it our own, and that's kind of the idea. So those are 3 examples we're going to go through, and hopefully we all learn something about fractal noise and doing it for ourselves. So first off, let's make some fractal noise going on and turn it into some undulating water. We're going to need 3 layers, and let's start it from scratch. So I'll start making a new composition. Your composition size should be whatever size you're going to use it at. So if this is going to be used in an animated piece or it's going to be used somewhere else, just be aware of your frame rate and frame size. 1920 by 1080 is going to be totally fine for us. So water example. Now, fractal noise has to live on a solid, so you can create a new solid by right-clicking down here, or you can always go layer new solid. That's perfectly good too. I don't tend to name these, but you want to make sure they are indeed the comp size so that the square that we're putting things on takes up the whole frame. You can take up more than the frame if you want. You can resize it. But now we're going to get our best friend fractal noise out into the mix. And by default, it looks like a bunch of clouds. That's not particularly helpful for us. We're going to apply a few things over top of this. Let's start by making the pool surface at the bottom. And I know I'm probably going to want to blur this, so let's get a Gauss in the house, Gaussian blur here. Gaussian? I'm going to say Gaussian. I think I've been corrected to say Gaussian. And then you can see how that is now making these less distinct clouds. You can do that in the fractal noise effect itself. You can do that down here under complexity if you bring complexity down. But notice that this makes it squarer, and that's all because of the type of fractal that's going on. If I were to change this to spline, you can see that that is a different way that it'll look. So by changing the fractal type and by changing the noise type, we're going to end up with totally different results. And we're going to play around with a bunch of them. But for now, let's work with the basics. Let's increase the contrast a little bit. Let's take the transform and scale that up a little bit. And then we'll use our blurriness to make it less distinct down here like that, and maybe a little less contrast like that. And then we don't want black and white values, so we're going to dip into the family, the beautiful family of tinting things. So you could use a tint on this. So let's say this is the bottom of a pool, and we're just going to take the blacks and make them into a blue, and we're going to take the whites and make them into a more different blue, like this. So there we go. We've made it blue and blue. If you want a little bit more nuance, then you probably want to use a tritone. So we're going to drop a tritone onto this instead. So I've disabled this effect, and I'll just say, hey, I'll make this middle one here into the blue zone, and then we'll take the dark patch here. We'll make that blue like that. Hey, look at that, you've got blue. Remember, anything you change at the top of the stack is going to be permeated down through everything else. So if we make it more or less blurry, you see that that's propagating through. And if we were to make it more or less contrasted, that is propagating through as well. As well, the scale, if we scale that up and down, everything is propagating through. So keep that in mind as we keep working. So we've got an unremarkable bottom of the pool. I'm going to just go ahead and duplicate that because we're going to reuse a bunch of the things that we've got going on in here. And this one will be our highlights, the highlight of the water that tells us something is going on. And hola, Olivia, hello. Buenos dias, buenos tardes, I suppose. I don't know what time of the day it is in Spain. So we've got our fractal noise, and I'm going to switch from basic, and we are going to go down to strings. This looks totally different. It's a totally different way of looking at the thing. And so we're going to bring the transform down. Let's bring that scale down like this. You can see how that would express itself being small or large. And these are really going to form those types of caustic strings. I can bring the complexity way down, which you can see is removing all those little substrings that are going on, right? You can also come into your subsettings, and we could scale those up and down. You can see how those substrings are getting larger and smaller. So many different things that you can modify here. So something like this, maybe, is going to be good. And keeping in mind, you can also warp up your contrast like this. So it's really only black and white values. And if you were to bring your brightness down and up, you can see that we're getting some stuff like that. But usually you're going to need to deploy something like a curves on top of this. So let's put a curves in here as well, so that we are then able to manually affect this in a nice smooth way. And we promised looping, so let's come into our fractal noise and get this moving. So I'm going to come down here, and let's purge out the tint so it's not confusing us. And let's come into the evolution. And the evolution, you can see as I adjust this value, everything's just changing. So I'm going to hold down Option, click on the stopwatch. We are going to type in what's called an expression in here, which will create some automatic motion. You can keyframe this if you want, but I'm just going to go time times maybe 40. So we're taking the time in seconds and we're multiplying that by 40. And that is producing this stuff. So there we go. And now what we want to do is make sure it loops. So make sure under your evolution options you say cycle, which means that it's going to repeat every time it loops around. You can see that evolution is expressed here in seconds. So every time that it comes back around, that is going to be the exact same as it was before. So every loop around is a loop, 360 degrees around the evolution. So hopefully that'll be helpful as you try to loop this stuff. But pretty good caustics. I think this is working out. I'm going to switch this mode to add, so it is being additive over the other layers. And we are going to use the tritone on this as well. And we might need to adjust the colors as we go, maybe making it a little bit bluer, maybe making the shadows a little bit darker so that they really recede like that. But we've got some pretty nice bright highlights on there. To produce the shadows that would result from the same highlights, we can just duplicate the highlights, and we're going to call this shadows, like this. And it's not going to be set to add, it's going to be set to multiply. That's going to be not going to be particularly helpful because the fractal itself, if we just solo this layer, right, is creating dark patches, and we want to invert this. So we could say, well, I'll hit this invert button and that should do it. Whoa, Why is that totally different and weird? Because we're inverting the math, not necessarily the resultant color. So we are just going to put an invert on top of this, put it in back here so that it's happening kind of at the right the right moments. And again, we want to make sure that this is set to multiply, and so we can see that when it sort of goes under the things and we move it over, that's looking pretty good. And remember, the seed for both of these is exactly the same. So they are going to produce identical swirls. So if we come into here and we go into the fractal noise, notice they're both evolving the same way. We want to come into the transform and we want to offset one under like this. So they are now offset from each other. So we've got the top and the bottom. Now I'm going to cut to the original version that I did so we can talk a little bit about the colors, because it took a little bit of a while to get these dialed in sort of exactly with this stuff. So I ended up with adding kind of mid-range colors on top using the tritone. And if we just kind of solo that, you can see how that looks. It's a bit of a subdued effect. And you really do have to play around with the various settings to make this work. But then the next one under that is the shadows. And you can see in the shadows, its colors, we're just tinting them. We are blurring them. We're using that Gauss blur so that the shadows are a little bit blurry. And if we come down here to the pool bottom, we're going to end up with this type of thing. And when we layer them over top of each other, it looks a little bit like this. And finally, we want to bring the whole thing together with an adjustment layer on top. And we can crunchitize stuff. See, if we steal the red out of here using a curves, it makes everything nice and blue. So hopefully this has created some nice undulating pool water for you. Get your settings dialed in exactly how you want. Get the colors blending. Make it as real or unreal as you'd like. And hopefully that'll be good. But let's move on to a softer example, something that maybe blends a little bit more with the natural environment, with a little Aurora Borealis. So because we are pressed for time, I'm going to take you on a little tour of the Aurora file here so that you can see exactly what's going on. We've got our photo in the background, which is really just telling us the kind of perspective we want. And on top of that, we have this layer here that is a precomposed Aurora, right? And General Kenobi, I don't think I'm going to be doing any triangles today. I promised no triangles, so we don't know if we're doing any of those. But the precomposed Aurora here begins its life quite normally. So I'm just going to go ahead and make it not three-dimensional. And you can see that, you know, it starts just like any other fractal. So if I just, ZZZ, take that back. And I'll show you, I would make a new solid, make it the comp size, like this. Or maybe you would even need to make it quite larger. So you might make a new solid that is humongous, maybe a 3000 by 3000 thing, because I know I'm going to need to scale and squash this around. And then we are going to put our fractal noise onto that. Fractal noise. I don't want clouds at all, this type of basic look. That's not for me. Instead, I might be thinking maybe threads. No, because that looks too much like cloth. No, I think swirly is where we're at. We're going to give it a swirly like this. We transform the swirly to make it quite large, right? And we might invert it so that we get the bright patches and the dark patches balanced the way we want. And now, here we go. We are going to just go ahead and sort of warp this around. Now, one of the ways, there are many ways we could warp this. If we bring our sort of photo example into the background here to get a sense of the perspective, you can really see, you know, this doesn't look like Aurora Borealis, not even close yet. So we might use something like the power pin. You might use CC power pin on this, and that will allow you to distort things like so. So this is a nice way. Things are looking pretty nice and distorted like that. Maybe we would grow that up like so. Power pin can get us close, but I personally would just make this layer three-dimensional and then tilt it until it looks how I want, and then kind of scale it up into place like this. Now the reason I'm doing that is because we're going to pre-compose this anyway. So we're going to go select any of the layers we've got, Command-Shift-C, create a new composition out of them, and that will help us composite it into place and not have to worry about the 3D-ness of it all, okay? So the other thing that you might want to do is on this layer, apply a mask. Grab your circle tool here, hold down Shift, double-click, And now we've got a nice big circle. That's still not really blending with the sky very much. So we are going to come down here and we're going to go into the mask itself. Let's say we feather this by 250 pixels. Oh, we can still see the edge. It's still very edgy over there. So I would then expand this, or contract it rather, contract it in like that. So now we have a big floating disk in the sky, but as soon as you go ahead and you change its blending mode to something like add, now it's looking much more like it belongs, right? So that's how we can get this into place. And remember, if we wanted to evolve the fractal noise, it's the evolution option that you want to change in here. So you could keyframe this, or you can set an expression time times, say, 40, and we're going to see that undulation in the sky. Now, like I said, the solution to this, here's my excellent undulation. Go like there. So we've got it positioned right where we want, and then I'm pre-composing this aurora back here, and I'm putting a whole bunch of other effects onto it. Now, the reason that we're doing it that way is so that I can have some independent control over the blurring, not related to where it sits three-dimensionally. So if I put a directional blur on this, if we observe that, you can see directional blur just going straight up and down. That effect is getting the striations sort of moving away, right? And then maybe I want to put on a CC radial fast blur, but the more I blur it, the less I can see anything. So at the top of the stack, you probably want to put a curves on top of this. And the curves will help you here in the RGB spectrum of sort of making it brighter or darker by cranking this curve up so we get more of the bright highlights that we want. And then similarly, we would probably cap it off with the levels after we've done our blurs, and that's going to help us dial that in even more. Be aware of blooms. You don't want to bloom out too much, so be reserved. And then finally, we're going to put on a CC toner. And CC toner, again, similar to the other family of tint effects, is giving us highlights, brights, midtones, dark tones, shadows. And we've dialed those into some in the green area, and then the dark ones more into the purple zone. And then when you put this on, say, linear dodge, or maybe a screen, or maybe an ad, right? The way that blends over top of everything, I'm just going to set it to normal so you can see what that would look like. A big terrifying dark cloud, but because we're only taking the bright parts, set it to add, that's looking pretty good. Now, I have toyed around with putting what's called a camera lens blur in here, but it really crunches a lot of the good looking striations out. And if we press play, you can see how that's undulating so nicely. Oh my goodness, that is really a magnetic spectrum of madness going on up there. So hopefully this makes some sense as we're undulating stuff and we are blurring it. We're stretching out those values. We're starting with a black and white cloud. We're getting it arranged exactly how we want, and then we're bending those things into the lines that we want. So hopefully that is helping out. The third example, let's stop relaxing by looking at the night sky and let's create some anime speed lines. So here we are, anime speed lines in After Effects. How are we going to make this? It's all going to sit on one layer. It's going to be a doozy. I'm going to start with the final, and I'm going to kind of show you one layer at a time so you can see how it builds up, and then we'll make it from scratch. So the fractal noise will go on first. We dial that in how we want. Give it a little bit of a blur, so it's now going sideways. Then we are maybe going to use a power pin to stretch it into kind of angle that we want. Finally, a transform will then blow that up so we're not missing those corners over there. And then a levels to highlight and enhance what we've got. CC toner to get those colors doing exactly what we want. And then finally, the Posterize Time, because this thing is going to be animated. And that looks pretty good. That's a little speed racer, but we put Posterize Time on here. And if you are indeed doing this with animation, maybe you want it 12 frames a second, maybe you want it 8 frames a second. It's all going to be down to your taste and how this is going to composite with other elements. So think about that when you are posterizing time. Okay, let's make it from scratch so you don't have to figure it out on your own. Create the new solid. Make the solid the comp size. Okay, we are going to make Fractal Noise, bring some of that. This is our base that's going to come down. And on top of that, I said we are going to need to blur it. Now, you could use a directional blur. You could directional blur that sideways and blow it out like this. But you see how the edges are getting harmed, right? I'm not interested in that. Get that away from me. So directional blur, you got to go. We are going to use the Gauss in the house blur. Bring that in here. And we're only going to go horizontally. We're going to increase that blurriness. And we have the ability to repeat the edge pixels. So that is the power of this. So that's why we want the Gauss blur here. Now, this looks like some stretched out clouds. So we actually want to start not with the basic. I want to start with some block, right? I want to get blocky with it. So let's see. I believe if we go back to that original example, the one that I ended up selecting was basic plus block. So if we come back into here, basic plus block, it looks like this. So it looks much more like cubes everywhere. And then it's a matter of more contrast, lower brightness, more contrast, less brightness. And then when we stretch that out, that's starting to look a lot more jagged, right? And you still want to go, yeah, more contrast, less brightness. So this is a great way to play with it, get it looking good. And remember, it's the evolution that's got to go. So just like all the previous examples, but if this one's fresh, hold down Option, click on the evolution stopwatch, and we type in the expression zone. We're typing in here time times maybe 60. So it's really going good. Or maybe let's go like 600. Let's really get it ramped up. And we are going to clamp that with a Posterize Time on the back end. So that's going to get chopped down to 12 frames a second. So it's looking a little something like this. Now remember, we need something like a levels in the mix. So levels is going to come in, and levels is going to help clamp down some of these values so we get brighter ones and we get darker ones, increasing our contrast. I used a power pin in here to get this looking specifically how I would like. So pinching this side down, leaving that side alone. You could scale the layer up like this, but sometimes you want to use instead a transform effect. So we're going to drop that down after the power pin, scaling us up like that. Press and play. It's looking pretty good so far. Now, the color is not quite right. And so obviously we want to play with our levels, and we're going to play with our CC toner again. So let's bring that down, and let's say the highlights totally bright. Great. Switch us into pentatone. Let's get our brights. I don't know. Let's go something in the yellow, sort of a bright, maybe yellow. Then the next kind of level in the midtones, let's get into maybe a red. Ooh, yes. Okay. Now in the dark tones, let's go purple. Let's get purple with that. Yes. And then let's leave black as black. So we're doing a slightly different color combo here, but remember, it can be whatever you want, anything you'd like. So we've got the pre-toned colors coming in here. So if you want to increase the contrast, use the levels like this. You could have a post levels on top of this as well. If you come in here and you think, my colors are pretty good, but I really want to increase the contrast even after I've had my colors applied to it, you might want to do that as well. Now, you could use curves instead. So levels and curves perform similar functions. So the reason I tend to use the levels coming into things because I'm crunchitizing them linearly. Curves gives us the ability to do a very similar thing. So if you wanted a linear crunchitizing using, crunchitizing is the technical term, you would do this. And then if you wanted a more nuanced curve to it, you might do something like that. So if you're more of a curves person, if that's what you're feeling, that's how you can make that happen. So, oh boy, we're really coming into time here. I hope this has been helpful to kind of build your effects. So let me just take you through a really quick recap of all of the things that we did, starting with the end. So here we did some anime speed lines all on one layer. It was built up by doing a fractal noise. The big changes to the fractal noise were we switched the type to basic, and we have the noise type as a block. After that, we put a Gauss blur on here. Gaussian blur, Gaussian, and we choose horizontal only, and allows us to repeat those edge pixels, giving us crispy edges. We like that. CC power pin to squish it into the way we want it by manipulating these little edges, getting those squished down. Transform, bring that back up, so while we've got the angle exactly how we want, we might need to make it much larger so it still fits in frame. Then it is either a curves or a levels to crunch the values, CC toner to get the colors the way we want, Posterize Time to get things animating how we want. The animation is coming from the evolution of the fractal noise, on which we have placed the expression time times 600. Okay, so that's those. We've got the Aurora Borealis going on here, a nice softer version of the same type of thing. You'll see a theme, CC toner, levels, radial fast blur going on. So we are basically creating a cloud of bright and dark things. We're manipulating it using blurs, making it sharper, making it blurrier, and then we are simply getting it to the right colors and blending it over top of things. The actual manipulation of the angle here was done by making the layer three-dimensional, and then we mask it off. We feather that mask so that the feather and the expansion, right, it is feathered as much as it's expanding, therefore we don't see the edges. Perfect. Just keep in mind that the type of fractal that you use, this one here, is a swirly and soft linear. So that's why I have those swirly patterns. And then the first example, the water, we use many duplications, highlights and shadows, and these are using the Fractal Noise. That is, again, strings set to spline. It's the same thing. It's a duplicate for both, but one is the inversion of the other. Before we recolor them, put them back over top. So that brings us to the end of it. That is Fractal Noise 3 ways. Oh boy, my voice is killing me. Talked way too much, way too fast, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can start to shape fractal noise into some effects that are going to be helpful for you. I like the anime speed lines myself the best, so please. Oh, and I've run out of time. Oh, now we've run out of time, but I'm going to close it up here, so in case this gets used in the edit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.